Hi, welcome back. Today, the next tutorial is going to be over the Welt seam. We're doing seam finishes for the apparel industry. So we just finished the flat felled seam, which is on your jeans, your heavy duty, that'll hold up under a lot of wear. Now we're going to do the Welt seam, which is kind of like a mock finish for that flat felt seam. So the construction process is a little cheaper. It has different steps to it, but it's not as thick either. So I have my little piece of paper here that I'll show you how to work those later, but we're going to do the Welt seam, and this is part of an industrial finish. So I have my two pieces of material here together. I already have the right sides together, and I'm just going to put them on my machine, and I'm going to stitch at 5/8. Get it on here. I'm using a contrasting white just so you can see it a little bit easier. Get my sides lined up. If you want to use pins, use pins, but we're going to stitch our 5/8. So we have our 5/8 inch stitch, and you can start up higher, go down lower. Right now we're just kind of concentrating on seam finish techniques, so I'm not too worried about closing a seam off. Now we're going to take it over to the ironing board and iron, and we're going to press it flat. And then just like our flat felt, we're going to open it up and we're going to press it to one side. Get it nice and flat, press it to one side. And I always turn it over, make sure it's good and flat. Okay, so once again, you're going to want to press it to the side that you want your top stitching. So what we're going to do next, if you remember on the flat felt seam, this is where we trimmed the under seam, but for this technique, we're going to leave it flat. And we're going to go from here and we're going to take it back to our sewing machine. And we're going to top stitch, and I'll show you right here. I'm going to top stitch and edge stitch really close to the seam line. And I'm going to do white so you'll be able to see it well. Get them started in the right place and hope that I can sew straight. Okay, so as you can see, I'm going to trim this off, and then you can zoom in here and see how close we are to the actual, maybe I'll turn it this way for you, how close we are to the actual seam line. So that's a really tight edge stitch. Now, if we look at the back, it's stitched down there, but we still have all of this loose stuff. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take it over to the serger, and we're going to overlock. I'm going to push all of this back so it's just the seam allowance, and I'm going to put the side, I'll show you again so you get the right side. So this side that is up, I want the top stitching line of my serged edge this side. So you're going to make sure you bring it right over to your serger with that same side up, and get my presser foot here. And we're just going to make sure all your material is out of the way and it's just the seam allowance. And we're going to trim him off. We'll bring it back over here where you can see it better. So now we have that serged edge. I'm going to flatten this back out. And you can see you have that serged edge. I'm going to hit it with the iron real quick to make sure that it's good and flat. And we're going to bring it back over here to our sewing machine, and we're going to top stitch it with another stitch line so we look like the flat felt seam that we just did. So I'm going to come over about 1/4 inch and stitch beside it. And that will catch all of the seam allowance on the underside. So the edge of my presser foot is my 1/4 inch. Started kind of slow there to get him lined up, and just sew straight following the first stitch line. And we'll trim off our threads. All right, so there, that looks very similar to your flat felt seam that we just created, but if you feel it, it's a lot thinner because it's just the seam allowance is flat here on the background. So if you look at jeans, a lot of times jean construction is like this. Especially if it's a thick jean, if it needs a little more stretchability. So while you're looking at that, I'm gonna grab a pair of jeans and I'm gonna show you, we'll look at the back and compare apples to apples here. So this is a welt seam. So on the front, it's in blue top stitch, but you can see it has the double top stitch line. So from the outside, it looks like it's a flat felt seam, but on the inside, it's flat with an overlock, and so it's really a welt seam. So you can see it looks just like this, except the top stitching thread is different, and I used an overlock of black, so it isn't noticeable. But if you compare the two fronts, I'll just fold that up a little bit, and look, they're both a double needle top stitch. Now what's interesting on this particular pair of jeans, if you look at the other side, it is also the double needle top stitch, but it is a true flat felt seam. So they did one flat felt and they did one welt seam on these pair of jeans. So in the industry, you will find both of these with your heavyweight types of materials, your denims, but it's a really cool construction. So if you're a consumer, look for that. Go look at your jeans when you go home and see what kind of finish they have. This one is less thick. It's cheaper because you don't have the turn under and the extra thickness to go through. So the actual price of the production line is a little cheaper. So just interesting things to look at if you're a buyer or want to be in merchandising and buying. Understand what you're looking at when you're buying and know what kind of questions to ask. So here is the end of the tutorial for the welt seam, and come back to one a really cool seam, which is the Hong Kong seam finish.